Hello, everybody. Good afternoon if you're watching here in the States, and good evening if you're coming to us live from the UK. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Keras Circle. Keras Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Keras Books, and Keras Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm joined this afternoon by Juno Dawson, who is the international best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction for young adults. She is a columnist for Attitude magazine and a key LGBTQ plus activist with the charity Stonewall. A former teacher specializing in behavioral studies, Juno now writes full-time and lives in Brighton, England. And she's here to discuss What's the Tea, the guide to all things trans and or non-binary. I am delighted to talk to her about this book because for folks who are from Atlanta, we're going to match. You all know that a huge part of Keras's feminist work in the world is supporting trans and non-binary and gender queer folks of all ages. So it's important to us that we support trans people across the spectrum of our lives from birth to death. And the right of all people to have bodily autonomy and dignity. What's happening in the States right now with Roe v. Wade, with anti-trans bills, particularly trans girls being picked on in, the state of Georgia, all kinds of things are happening. So it was really important to us during Pride Month to get to talk about this really valuable resource. So I wanted to start off by just saying welcome and ask you, how are things going for you? Juno, how are you?
I'm good. We were just discussing I may or may not have some sort of food poisoning or stomach bug or something. It's definitely not COVID. I've already had that. But yeah, so I don't feel my best, but all is well. It's sunny. It's summer. I've just got back off my honeymoon. So I'm very happy despite feeling a little bit worse for wear. Nor am I hungover. I just want to stress nor am I hungover.
You're like, you're felled by life, not by your own poor choices, which is always, I always feel much better about myself when that's the case. Well, thank you for being here. I know we have a lot of parents probably in the chat as well as teens and young adults. So I want to encourage folks that if at any time you want to ask questions for Juno, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll work them into our conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit about, how you structured this book. It is the follow-up to a previous book that focused on lesbian, gay, and queer bisexual folks. And I wonder kind of what made you decide to write this book?
It came about quite politically. This to wind back the years to 2012 when I was writing This Book Is Gay. I had just been dumped by the man that I thought I was probably going to marry. I figured out that I was trans. I wasn't having the best year, and I hated that book so much. It was like pulling teeth. And then when it came out in America a couple of years later, I really struggled in doing the American edition because I've never lived in America, and they were asking me to write it for the American market, and I was like, I don't know, I've never lived. And so after This Book Is Gay, I kind of said, look, I'm never ever going to write nonfiction ever again. But then I did lots of times. And What's the Tea kind of came around because I was furious, in the decade since I'd written This Book Is Gay, things have gotten actively worse for trans people in the world. When I came out in 2013 to my friends, it did feel like this new age of like trans awareness and, trans people being discussed in a broadly positive way. And then over the next kind of 3 or 4 years, I just saw things get worse and worse, in both of our countries. And then when I think we came into sort of 2018, and, and I think one of the key differences between the UK and the US is that at least in the US, there is very clearly divided political lines around trans lives, where the right are staunchly against trans people and the left are inclusive of trans people, whereas in the UK, just everyone's against trans people. And we've got the most powerful liberal newspaper, The Guardian, is broadly very transphobic. And it just felt like, even as one of the more platformed trans people in the country, that just I wasn't being listened to, and neither was any trans person. And it felt like a lot of people were speaking about trans youth, but certainly no one was speaking to trans youth. They were almost a completely silenced group in this whole, whether you want to call it a conversation or a debate. And I was like, well, I work with tons of trans kids. If I can in some way kind of start to give them a voice in a way that isn't outing them or, compromising them in any way, then I think I should do that. And so I knew that This Book Is Gay had been by far and away my best-selling title. So I knew there would be an appetite. So I went to my agent and I said, I think now is the time. I think we should follow up This Book Is Gay with something that does sort of zero in on the T of LGBTQ. And while trans issues had been touched on in This Book Is Gay, there was so much more to discuss. And so off we went and we pitched it to my publisher, and of course they were on board, and that was true of Source Books in America as well. So it was kind of academic, really. I just had to sit down and write it. And I mean, This Book Is Gay has reached so many homes and schools and libraries. It's the 9th most banned book in America at the moment. Thanks. Which is, I mean, I really struggle to get my head around it, because that, I must admit, that doesn't really happen in the UK. We don't really ban books. We have J.K. Rowling, but we don't ban books. Swings and roundabouts. And so I just hope that What's the Tea kind of does the same thing. And what's funny about This Book Is Gay is it has sold the same number of copies each year since 2013. So it just sells and sells. It's like a little perennial. It pops up. You water it once a year, and during Pride Month, Barnes and Noble put it on a display. And that's the way it kind of goes. And so I just hope, I know This Book Is Gay has found the people it was meant to find. And it's just my hope now that What's the Tea will find its audience in the same way.
I think it absolutely will. And, by the way, that's the perennial best-selling book is the thing that all authors pray for. So in that sense, it is a blessing for sure. But you're right. I mean, I think going back, it may really surprise Americans to hear the differences, the cultural differences in transphobia between the US and the UK, because I think many Americans assume that the UK is better than the US, and I think or they assume that there are places in the US that are better than the UK, just and then there are places in the because the US is such a huge and varied country culturally. That's true, actually, probably across the board, that you can find almost anywhere in the US culturally that is better or worse than probably anywhere else in the world, because it's such a varied country. But one of the struggles that we have legislatively in the United States, which you point out in the book, is because we are this patchwork of laws and cultures in this country, it can be very, very difficult as a young person to figure out, okay, well, what does my path in life look like, especially if you're trying to navigate, and as an adult, frankly, as you're trying to navigate change. I like you, we're the same age, and just about, and I, like you, came out when I was around 30, and even doing all of those, sort of medically transitioning and legally transitioning as an adult, the patchwork of all of the laws and the conventions and all those things that you have to follow are challenging. And I, like you, I'm somebody who had resources and had a lot of privileges to do that. And I think that's one of the things that people don't realize about trans life. It's just how much headachy BS.
So much admin, so much outrageous amounts of admin. And that I was I don't know if I endeared myself to my new editor at Source Books, but I learned my lesson from This Book Is Gay, which is I am just not best placed to give legal advice to American youth about being trans. And so I sort of almost kicked it back to the editor and said, the worst thing we can do is give bad advice to young trans people who are likely to be experiencing some degree of crisis at best. And that was something that I kind of moved on to source books, because again, culturally, the one thing that we do have in the United Kingdom is a National Health Service. It's not perfect, it's deeply, deeply flawed, but it does mean there is a very, very regimented medical pathway. And so in the UK version of the book, I was able to very succinctly say, look, this is what's going to happen to you if you choose to go down a medical route. Of course, there's no obligation for trans people to go down a medical route whatsoever. But in terms of America, and I think it's so right that you related this back to Roe versus Wade as well, which is, it feels now with the United States, we're almost dealing with, you know, a multitude of almost different countries. It's almost like different territories that just happen to be on the same piece of rock. And that was why when you're giving a book that is supposed to have advice in, you just have to be incredibly, incredibly careful. But the good news is that I think both This Book Is Gay and What's the Tea, they are one source of guidance, you know, and there is the internet and I think I say in both editions of the book, find your local trans people, because that's what I wish I'd done. You know, the NHS, I was treated and remain to be treated exclusively by cis people who have said the wildest things. Just this week, I had a meeting with the gender clinic. I can't even repeat what the doctor said because I was like, that's very inappropriate. And so I wish, you know, if I was going to go back and tell 29-year-old Juno, I would say the best thing you can do is speak to other trans people. But in some small way, that's What's the Tea kind of is. It's a collection of wisdom, I guess, from trans elders, which is depressing. I think if you're over 25 years old, you're a trans elder. Sorry to break the news. You are the trans elder.
True. I just was at a gathering of trans men and finally got an answer to a health question that no doctor I've ever had informed me about, you know. And I think one of the things that I think is really hard, you know, again, there's probably some parents, grandparents, godparents, you know, affirming adults on this, you know, watching this video. And the number one thing that I hear from parents is, I worry about my kid's health. I worry about my kid's safety. The reality is we don't have the science that we deserve to have about trans medicine, right? And you say something that I think is really helpful on page 22 of this book. You say it's not transphobic to have questions, it's transphobic to have concerns, right? Can you say a little bit more about that? Because this is a thing that I come up with parents a lot. Like, what is sort of concern and maybe concern trolling, and how do you see that as transphobic?
Oh my gosh, and you know, we could apply this to conversations around fat phobia and homophobia as well, and you know, HIV and AIDS. So many things we could apply that kind of, oh, you know, I've just got the concerns. But what about? Lots and lots of but what abouts, and I think they all stem from a place where being LGBTQ plus is a worst case scenario. And I think this is a hangover from the last century, which is, if you were gay or lesbian or bi or trans, you were an unfortunate, you know, you were a sad little misfit. But I think kids now, you know, are starting to regard being LGBTQ plus as a superpower. You know, it's something that doesn't make you unfortunate. It makes you, dare I say it, special. And I think that there is a slight generational divide there. When you look at kind of Gen Z with their Heartstoppers and their Euphorias and all this, you know, it's kind of this, you know, it's largely understood in any gathering of youth. There will be a diversity in that demographic. Non-binary kids and pansexual kids and demisexual kids and asexual kids. And that's kind of, they have this amazing lexicon that we just didn't have when we were teenagers. And I think, and I say this a lot, I get a lot of emails from young LGBTQ people, and I don't give advice because I'm not a therapist, but the word that I always come back to is patience. Because what I'm trying to say to them is, you've got this amazing power And it's called lifelong broadband. You have in your life been connected to this impossible encyclopedia that we just didn't have. And so what we're looking at is a generation of young people who are so much further ahead technologically, in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their scientific understanding, in terms of their compassion and empathy. And I think that's not to say that all young people are living in some sort of utopia and that all over 40s are awful, discompassionate bigots. That's just not true at all. But I just think there is maybe more so than a generation gap. There's a knowledge gap. And I think, so what I say to young people is that you do need to wait. The generation above is going to catch up, and they are learning, and they will learn by asking questions. And that's why I do say to a lot of young LGBTQ people, questions are fine. Concerns are possibly the result of, a different generation who still, and it's awful, isn't it? Because is it transphobic to say that you wish a person wasn't trans? Especially if that wish comes from a place of, oh, I'd rather, I think you would be safer if you were cisgender. Yeah, that's probably true. We can't pretend that's not true. But I think if we came at it from a point of view, which is that living authentically as whether you are lesbian or bi or gay or trans, that we know this, and we know through lots of studies that affirming young people's sexual or gender identity actually leads to better outcomes. They're going to be happier, they're going to be healthier, and probably safer, because happier and healthier kids are less likely to be engaging in risky sexual behaviors, drinking, drugs, self-harm, sorry, trigger warning. And so actually, I think if we try to put that in the forefront of our mind, that, that affirming young LGBTQ people is better for their health. And actually, so that's why we need to kind of, I guess, just reframe it. Just reframe the perception of young LGBTQ people, that it is not the worst case scenario. In fact, it's the best case scenario for that individual.
I think, one of the things that you do a really good job of is sort of dealing with some of those standard objections or questions that trans people often get, and some of it is really about language, right? And one of the things that I see online a lot is straight cisgender people saying, "I'm not cis, don't call me cis," which I always find confusing or strange. And it's like, well, why are you labeling people if you don't want to be labeled? This very sort of roundabout thing. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, because I've actually never seen another book address that kind of weird transphobia, and I found it very helpful.
Well, I mean, that's because that's something I've seen quite a lot in the UK, which is that it's kind of, you see a lot of kind of quite sad social media accounts where people are really saying, not cis, kind of like really angry. And I think it does stem from a sort of privilege, which is, if you've always belonged to the majority group, you're probably not massively used to being labeled. And I think that's very, very true around race as well, which is why, some people really bristle at the sheer notion of white feminism, because it's, what do you mean there's something wrong? What do you, as if white almost went unspoken for generations, kind of, and race was something that only belonged to Black and brown people. Well, hang on a minute. White people, have a race too. And so I think it's kind of, I wanted to address it through a cis person. In the book, we've got an amazing broadcaster. She's a radio journalist called Natasha Devon, speaks on being cis and why she's very happy to use the word cis. And I think it's because otherwise the only other word you've got is normal. And again, if you have a bunch of people describing themselves as normal, then by default, trans people become abnormal. And so again, we're never going to be able to reframe the perception of trans people socially if cis is the norm. And actually, for me, when I started my transition in 2013, I've never felt more normal. It was almost like, oh, okay, thank God, finally, you know, sort of this is how you are meant to be. And for the first 31 years, I was kind of like holding back a tide. And so actually for me, being trans felt way more natural than sort of masquerading as cis. And so I'm very blessed. I live in Brighton, which is the queerest little hub in England, kind of. So I'm surrounded by cis people who are very, very happy to describe themselves as cis, and hopefully it'll just catch on. I think it's a real shame that we have such resistance, even in our liberal press, that we're not seeing all of our sort of more liberal journalists describing themselves as cis. But I do think, do you know what? Even by denying you're cis, you are admitting that that's a thing. Kind of like you're admitting you understand what it means. If you're saying you're not cisgender, you at least understand it as a concept. So even if, you know, we can, you know, get the word out there. And I remember actually one of the most amazing allies I've ever worked with. And again, she's in her mid-50s, the editor of Glamour UK, a woman called Jo Elvin. The very first time she took me out for lunch to ask me to write my column, I did like it's quite naff now, isn't it? I did a transition diary for a women's glossy magazine. But I was very poor. Look, I was quite poor.
I bet you took some hearts and minds.
Well, that was kind of the idea. And the first lunch, Jo Elvin said, "Look, I just asked a question." She was like, "What does cisgender mean?" And I was like, "Well, I'll stop you there. It's a soft C, like in cinema." And so I was like, "It's cisgender." And then as soon as I just said, "Look, we can't describe you as normal and me as transgender," and she was like, "Oh, okay, yeah." And all it took, and she just got it. It was just that. Again, it was one of those, because it was a very online phrase. She was seeing it on Tumblr, which again dates us. She was seeing it a lot on Tumblr and Twitter, and she was like, and actually very rarely, sometimes when people are having these conversations, and I think this is very true of things like subreddits and Reddits as well, nobody's actually taking the time to explain what this very online terminology often means. And so with books like What's the Tea, I always see it as a starting point, a beginning of a conversation. And actually, I don't want to exclude anyone from that conversation. So actually, it's really important to me that I do sort of take time to spell out, look, you might have heard this word online, but and granted, yes, it has a strange soft C that we don't use very often, but it's nothing to be afraid of. And what's interesting, a lot of those people who are saying they are, who will deny that they are cis, are very happy to use the word straight or very happy to use the word heterosexual, both of which are terminology which only came through in the back end of the 20th century. So, resistance to the word cisgender is ridiculous. And I think probably within the next 5-10 years, it's a word that pretty much everybody is going to understand. And
yeah, I mean, it's always been confusing to me. It's like it costs you nothing to just call people what they want to be called, in general. Like, it's really, it is a free way to show respect to people, and then you don't have to agree with anything else about them, but like calling people by their name and the pronouns that they use.
It's a description. It's a descriptor. Would you prefer not hyphen trans? Because that's weird. That's not cute. That's, hi, my name's John, I'm not trans. That's weird as well. So I think it just, again, that word patience, which is within the community, of course, we're a little bit ahead in terms of the words we use to describe. So that's my dog making a weird noise. That he's not a goose, he's a chihuahua. That I think we're just a little bit ahead. And so I think patience, that there should be limits to our patience. But we know, and we have always known, when people are coming to these conversations in good faith.
Yeah. And I think
it is. It's one thing for Jo Elvin to kind of ask me over lunch, and it's another for somebody to write a diatribe in the Atlantic about why they won't use the word cisgender.
Yeah, I have no idea who bought the Atlantic, but it's really quite gone to hell recently with transphobic foolishness.
Oh, I can tell you,
Um,
I can literally tell you why. Because of Helen Lewis. She's a British journalist who now writes for The Atlantic.
okay, that is helpful because it's been
They
full of trash lately.
yes.
Um, I do really appreciate this thread of patience, and I think, again, when I'm supporting cisgender and often straight parents of trans or gender creative kids who are just coming out, they are coming to me because they're already on board with, I love my child, I'm supporting my
Mm-hmm.
child. They are terrified that they are going to say the wrong thing or hurt their kid, or somehow, I think there is this fear, and a lot of it is born of how failed our discourse is more broadly in our cultures, but also on the internet in particular. This idea that, like, if I don't use the right words on the first try, I will be forever sort of damned as a ignorant or intentionally hateful person or a transphobic person, and then I'll never be able to recover from that. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we've taken this broader internet-based kind of framework and distilled it down to the interpersonal and the familial a lot of the time, and our fears, which are born of that, larger discourse, often bear out in our families. And so parents are often very afraid, or even just adults in friend relationships, or even people who are like, I would be down to date trans people, but I am afraid of saying the wrong thing. All
Mm-hmm.
these kinds of things, right? Like, it's not about desire, it's about a political fear that I am going to be wrong. They say, well, what if I mess up? And I think the flip side of that is a lot of trans folks, as you said, are we are out of time and out of patience. But also, I think our trans folks' patience is often very underestimated, right? The number of people who still misgender me, who I know love me, but 10 years into my transition, still call me she sometimes, right? Or call me by my birth name. Uh and I'm just like, well,
Mm-hmm.
like, that's clearly about you. That's not about
Yeah.
me.
And
My patient.
context. I
Yeah.
mean, like my
Yeah.
grandma has dementia. I
Yeah.
cannot expect my 85-year-old grandma with Alzheimer's to. Actually, I mean, she doesn't know who I am now. It's even sadder.
Yeah.
Or she thinks I'm my sister. But there was, right in the early days, of course, she found it challenging to get my
Yeah.
name right. Um, but I think in terms of those concerns, I think what I would ask cis people and allies and family members to recognize is there is a huge disparity in the fear. Like, if you are a cisgender person who's worrying about using the wrong pronouns, yeah, that's fine. However, a trans person is worried that the government is going to stop giving us healthcare. We are worried that we might be assaulted on a date. We're worried that we might be verbally abused in the street or spat at. All of these are things that have happened to me. And so I would say, in the politest possible terms, go for it. because we as trans people, we have slightly more, we have got more pressing concerns than your sort of etiquette worries. and,
Yeah.
and that's interesting, and that's a real thing. I'm so scared I'm going to get it wrong, and I'm scared I'm going to get murdered. So let's swap. And that's something that I would say to our allies is to bear in mind as well, that we need your support for very real reasons. And we appreciate you trying to get these niceties right.
Mm-hmm.
But we all have got bigger things to worry about. Look at the world, politically, environmentally, globally. War. Europe is at war. It's kind of we need your support quickly and readily so that we can kind of move on. Kind of.
Yeah. Well, and the irony, of course, of this etiquette, etiquette quibbles while the world is burning, is that it is often framed as trans people who are quibbling over etiquette and language, and that we're hypersensitive snowflakes, right? When in fact that is never the case, or almost never, and yet that seems to be the mainstream press way of
It does hurt.
characterizing.
I'll say this, a kid once did say to me on a school visit when I think I was just touring one of my YA novels, does it hurt when people misgender you? And I was like, it does, but I think not in the way that you think. It's not. I'm not, going to be trying to get you cancelled. I'm not going to be trying to make you lose your job. It hurts because being trans is really tiring. And, while on one hand, my life since I transitioned has been very euphoric and my life has completely transformed in so many ways. But on the other hand, it's also been quite grueling. I've experienced transphobia and abuse. And then when somebody just says, sir, what room do you want? You're like, are you kidding me? And it's just like, what have I done? Why have I worked this hard? Why do I condition my hair 4 times a week for you to get my gender wrong? And so it just feels so sad when people get it wrong, but not in a kind of like I'm going to write about you on TikTok. It's not that. It's not why it hurts. It hurts. It hurts on a very personal level, not on a political level.
And again, that goes back to the bureaucracy and the sort of slow wearing down of stone that all of these small, daily indignities add up. And again, you and I think have sort of comparable levels of privilege and access to resources, and we're both white, and we have probably better experiences of transition in terms of being able to do the things that we needed to feel at home in our bodies. And certainly, many people do not have access to the things that they need. And so those daily indignities, they are even worse, I think, for many people, because they'll never be ameliorated, because they know they won't have regular access to hormones, and they won't have access to affirming healthcare. They will never have the surgeries that they hope to have, and I think that's also what people forget, because so many of the trans people who are visible are people who have had, in one way or another, access to the affirming healthcare that they needed to live, and so I also see that a lot from young people, and even people in their early 20s, just like, yeah, but I'm never going to be able to afford, particularly in America, what I need to live, and how am I supposed to go on like that? And I think it's a very challenging question, because many people can't afford COVID healthcare in America, let alone.
God, it's terrifying. I will say, as a British person, it blows my mind. It's just how I don't understand how such an advanced nation has got into this situation.
By design. I mean, completely by design, and because of racism mostly. It is completely designed to destroy people. I mean, there's no other reasoning for it. And so, when trans people say, like, I feel like I'm being left behind, I feel like I'm being left to die, like, the answer is sometimes yes, that's true. And I think that that's really, really a scary thing. And there's not an easy answer for that.
No,
there's just not.
And then somebody's just commented as well about non-binary identity as well, which is,
yes.
I mean, I don't know quite where the situation is in America, but in the UK, it's appalling. It's weird. There was a debate in the House of Commons 2 weeks ago where we're so at the beginning. It feels like we're playing snakes and ladders, and we haven't even left the first square. It feels, we haven't even got to the first ladder in terms of we can't even get non-binary people politically recognised in the United Kingdom. As it stands at the moment, if you want to have a driver's license or a passport in the United Kingdom, you still have to identify as male or female, which is outrageous, and it's embarrassing. It embarrasses me as a British person that we barely have left the gates. And yeah, I mean, how can I sit here and sort of say be patient when it's just like, it just feels like it just feels like there is no political incentive, certainly in the UK, to even make a start. But I mean, in the book, I spoke to Travis Albanza, Jamie Windurst, amazing non-binary activists that I so look up to, and it's just my hope it's my hope that through their persistence, that I hope eventually we can at least start to score some really early wins for people who identify as non-binary or genderqueer, because it's, you know, it's strange, isn't it, speaking about how, you know, being trans is a worst case scenario, but I actually feel very lucky that the way I felt about myself so easily fit into what we societally understand as womanhood.
Yeah.
You know, and so despite the sort of, and I, you know, there have been times in the last 10 years that have felt slightly ordeal like, but even with that said, you know, that there is privilege within my experience. And this is why, you know, I'm very mindful of using the phrase trans community, because that suggests that we're a monolith, and it suggests that we all have the same experience, and that's just not the case.
And that's, you know, yeah, I mean, I feel similarly that my sort of more binary transition, it's like I feel very genderqueer in my heart of hearts, but when I walk down the street, I have the safety and privilege of being read often as a cis straight man, and that really makes a huge difference in how I'm treated in the world and my safety and all of those things, much more than I experienced when I was a genderqueer appearing butch woman, right? So I have a very visceral experience of having lived on both sides of that and knowing the violence that I faced before and the complete invisibility that I experience now. And parents, again, you know, are experiencing this with their children, where there's starting to be inroads in places, you know, some of the schools in Atlanta, some the public schools are so in the UK, public and private can be called different things, but you know, the state funded schools in Atlanta are hit or miss in terms of their supportiveness for trans people, though that should not be the case. There should be uniform policies. It's not true. But some of the schools are really great, and but they are great for binary identified trans kids. They are not great for non-binary kids, and that's a thing that we're seeing a lot of parents, you know, along with non-binary trans adults being like, what do I do? What do I do for my kid? It'd be easy, quote unquote, if I was just trying to get my child to be allowed to use the girls' bathroom, but that's not the case. Now my child isn't allowed to use any bathroom, and now they have to go to the principal's office to use the bathroom and get a special key, and you know, all of this stuff that really you know, is causing problems, and now my child is a problem. And I think, you know, so for anyone who is disrupting the binary, the gender binary in ways that doesn't allow them to easily slot in one place or another, it does require a wholesale like intervention system. No, you go ahead.
I think this is why we need absolute coalition between kind of all LGBTQ people plus on the whole spectrum, because I think that sometimes I do regard sort of what has happened to trans people in the last 10 years as a bit of a canary in the coal mine, in that the way we've been treated will have this kind of almost ricochet effect back on gay men, lesbian women, bi people, non-binary people, anyone who is in some way gender non-conforming. And I mean, this is going to blow your mind, because we could have literally predicted this like on the Rosetta Scroll, that the British press has been so vehemently transphobic, particularly around bathrooms and women's spaces, that now the people who are being challenged and verbally aggressively assaulted in toilets, it's not trans women, it's lesbians. And you know, and it's kind of, so I mean, this is kind of, you know, we could have seen this. And of course, what's especially galling is a lot of the most vocal transphobes in the UK have been gay women who will not recognize the existence of trans women. And I'm just like, there is a horrible, very Black Mirror irony to this, which is, you know, lesbians will suffer through transphobia, but not in the way that you are saying they will suffer. And so it's, you know, and I think the word that I've been using a lot the last 12 months is coalition, which is within the LGBT community. It is not one community. There isn't an LGBT community. There are millions and millions of LGBTQ people all around the world. But I genuinely think this is why we march together. Because I think what affects one part of the LGBTQ acronym affects another somewhere down the line. And I think, just conversations about, drag queen story time. That's not necessarily trans people. The conflation of kind of trans people and drag queen, just, it's a mess. Yeah. It's a real mess. But I do think, this is something that a lot of trans people have been saying for years, which is, we have in the United Kingdom that we have a really odious organization called the LGB Alliance, who they claim to be made up of LGB people who want nothing to do with trans people. And I'm like, good luck.
Yeah. Well, so you and I both identify as feminists, and obviously Karis is a feminist bookstore. One of the things that we always say is, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, they're all root of the same sort of poison tree, fruit of the same poison tree of patriarchy. And that coalition piece, it's like, it goes back to bodily autonomy. It goes back to the idea that nobody would be, fighting all of this if it were not actually related to misogyny at every level, right? Like, transphobia often has to do with a sort of hysteria, I'm using that word intentionally, around sexual attraction, around being afraid of being, less of a man or too much of a woman, or all these different things, right? And that is some of the same stuff with homophobia, and so it is really painful when gay people are among the most transphobic, and it is really painful when people who also call themselves feminists are homophobic or transphobic. And so, in the US, we have that strain of anti-trans feminism. And I put it feminism in quotes because that version of feminism doesn't jive at all with what we believe at Karis is feminism, which is the liberation of all people, and the protection of, all people's dignity and human rights.
Well, I think sorry, go on, finish.
No, but I'm just, why do you think at this moment in time in the UK that strain of feminism has become the most prominent and visible strain?
Well, the answer to that first immediate question is because of a terrible lack of opportunity in the media, which is, it's really, really hard for young people to get a foothold in the mainstream media. It's even harder if you're a young woman. It's even harder if you're a young Black or queer woman, or a non-binary person, or a trans woman, sorry. And so how we're just getting these same voices, and we do slightly come back to this generation issue of the columnists and the journalists who are being given a big national platform. They've been in post since the 90s. We're hearing a lot of the voices, and also a lot of cronyism. A lot of the feminists who came up through the 90s basically hired their friends. So there is a terrible lack of diversity in the voices that we're hearing in the British media. So, and there's just this week, they've published a big national attitude survey, which shows that actually people are very compassionate towards trans people. The majority of the British public, and actually more women than men, actually, like well over 3/4 of women in the United Kingdom, are supportive of trans women's self-determination to live as women. They recognize them as women. There are questions about female participation in sport for trans women, on the general understanding that it's not fair. But I think as more research kind of comes out, and as actually we see more trans people participate in sport, I suspect that kind of resistance will fade as well. But certainly there wasn't any public resistance, for example, to trans women using public toilets or changing rooms in department stores or things like that. So actually, but that's my experience, as my family are from Bradford in the north of England. It's an industrial town. It is not a liberal area at all in particular. And yet my mum and her friends were, oh, okay. We're talking sort of, interestingly, women in their 60s who wouldn't describe themselves as feminists. And that's because they kind of came up through Thatcher's England, where sort of feminism kind of became a dirty word. It became something that was very grounded in academia, and by definition excluded working class women like my mum, who largely had to kind of stay home to raise kids because they couldn't afford childcare. So the strange thing is, I don't think my mum would describe herself as feminist, even though she works, she votes. She's surrounded by amazing women. She came up through a matriarchy, basically. And so that's really, really interesting to me, that in what feels like the loudest strain of feminism, I was going to say dominant, but I don't think it is, the yappiest strain of feminism in the United Kingdom, in the mainstream press, is quite trans exclusionary. And the problem is, and I think that's why the situation has got worse here, because you actually had kind of women in the suburbs who have never met a trans person because they live in Surbiton or something, some leafy corner of the United Kingdom. They've never met a real trans person, but they're almost being told by the media, this is something that you should have concerns about, and it's just dark, and I don't really see it getting better. And then, not helped by the fact we have enormously prominent celebrities, people like J.K. Rowling, J.K. Rowling has more followers on Twitter than would watch any news program in the country. So it doesn't matter. Even the BBC can say it's balanced until the cows come home. It doesn't matter, because there are more people seeing people like, well, any transphobe you care to mention, kind of have got millions and millions of Twitter followers. And I don't really know how you countenance that. I don't really know what we do about it. I don't really have an answer. But I think in general, to what you were saying about, feminism and trans women, in my mind, if you're excluding trans women, it's not feminism. And I think, look at what is happening with abortion in America. And I have no doubt we'll start probably having similar conversations here. I think it will catch on culturally. And the way the conversation around young trans men has evolved, with, I'm not going to name any books, I'm not promoting any of those books, but the way that a lot of these books now are feigning concern for young trans men about how, they are rendering themselves barren and sterile, this concern for young women's reproductive health. It's very Handmaid's Tale, isn't it? And the conversations around young trans men and abortion, it's the same conversation. It's a policing of reproductive rights, again, the women who are writing those books and having these conversations, I think they ought to be very, very mindful, because what we are talking about is patriarchy and bodily autonomy. And you can't argue for abortion rights in one breath, but then deny trans people their bodily autonomy in another. It's the same conversation. It's about the individual right to make decisions about your destiny, decisions about your life, and decisions about your body. So in my mind, arguing against the autonomy of trans people is by definition anti-feminist.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And yes, this concern trolling for trans boys and young trans men, is nothing but dressed up reproductive justice control. And it's fascinating to me that people, especially people who call themselves feminists, don't understand that.
And there's a pipeline there to the whole horrific tradwife thing as well, about what is the role of a woman in society. And as we know, that is a pipeline to white supremacy as well. And I just wish that people could see the way that these networks work, or do they? Or is that the thing? Or do they know it? do they actually see what they're a part of?
I think they spend a lot of time not seeing, trying not to see. But in Georgia, the anti-trans bill that passed on the same, literally as a packaged together deal with this anti-CRT, so anti-critical race theory, in schools bill in Georgia. So trans girls are not allowed in sports, and teachers are not allowed to teach anything about real history related to race in America, right? So the only good thing about that, those things have nothing to do with each other except in this narrow right wing vision of the world. And it's like, okay, so y'all have linked these threats together, and again, going back to this idea of coalition. Okay, well, let's make coalitions among people who believe that we should be telling the truth about America's white supremacist history and present in schools, and teaching our children about that history and about our current, government setup, and people who believe that, trans people exist and should be able to play sports and do whatever else they want, and that we are deserving of bodily autonomy, that it is all related, right? I mean, the anti, bodily autonomy is also very much about white supremacy. It's very much about, population control and eugenics and all that stuff. And it goes back to slavery in the US and in the UK, so, but people, you say that to right-wing people and they look at you like you are from Mars. So
yeah, it's interesting. I'm very given a lot of hope. So if things get much worse here, I'm going to move to Ireland. And I think what's really interesting is Ireland over the last decades has had this huge cultural reckoning, I think, with its past. And I think in order to move forward, our nations both have to have that reckoning. And I think America is. And I think that's what Black Lives Matter really started. I think it's that the first honest examination of our histories. But I don't think the UK has started doing that yet. In that, we have a prime minister who doggedly, serves up very regressive kind of rose-tinted views. He considers himself to be the second coming of Winston Churchill, who himself was deeply problematic. And, we've had the Jubilee this year. So, you can't, it's, if you criticize what it is to be British, you are somehow unpatriotic, which I think, that works both ways as well. But I think what Ireland did really well is it really went there. And I think that's why, first of all, the first thing that happened was gay people were allowed to marry, same-sex couples were allowed to marry. But in the same breath, they allowed self-identification for trans people as well. And the world has still turned. But then obviously LGBT people helped out when they repealed the 8th Amendment, which prevented women or people who can get pregnant from having abortions. And now it's working the other way. So all those people who campaigned for abortion rights in Ireland are now really pressing to support trans people. And Ireland is a really interesting example of what coalition can look like, which is all the groups who were suffering under the patriarchy are truly coming together. And Ireland now, and I never thought I would say this, but of Ireland and the United Kingdom, Ireland is by far the more progressive place to live now.
It's wild. I never would have thought that growing up in the 90s. But it's really been beautiful to see. We have a question in the chat that I want to make sure we get to before we wrap up. So Jennifer says, thank you for hosting this event. I'm a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma in the clinical mental health program. I'm curious if you'll share your experiences with your families during the time of transition and what resources were available to you to help you through that process. So is there anything, I know you said your mom and her friends were positive. Is there anything you want to say? And obviously both of us were adults when we came out. But.
Yeah. So I will say, I don't want to sugarcoat it. My mum, there was a period that I now refer to as the sky is falling period, where I thought I'd got away with it. The day I told my mum, she was like oddly calm. And I was like, gosh, that was easy. But then she very quickly cycled back and she was like, I think you're expecting me to be fine with this. And actually that what she needed was that right to reply. Actually, and I've said that to many a young trans person as well, which is what you were expecting them to say nothing. Like that was your honest expectation going in. Like, come on. like be real, kind of. And so I think there was a period where my mum had a lot of questions. I think it did help that I was an adult, but I was helped out. There's a group called Mermaids in the UK who largely exist to support, you know, families with trans kids, and they were very helpful. I gave her a bunch of resources that I found online as well. I wish there'd been more, and bless her, she read everything. And what she really, really needed was time. And I think at the moment in the UK, we have absolutely outrageous waiting lists on the NHS for people to be seen to access trans affirming healthcare. But it's interesting because obviously one of the big like misnomers is from transphobes is that you decide you're trans on the Monday and by Thursday you're in an operating theatre. You know, that just could not be further from the truth. At the moment in the UK, you would be lucky to be seen by a consultant for 3 years minimum, kind of. But it turns out I think what everybody needed was time. You know, I needed time to not feel that I was being swept along. My mum needed that time to realize that I was still the same person, that she wasn't, you know, that it wasn't some sort of science fiction transformation like in sort of Dallas where I would come in played by a different actor, kind of. You know, that this was like a very gradual shift. And I remember in one of the columns for Glamour, so this was actually kind of really early in my transition, I asked my mum, do you think I've changed? And she was like, no. And I think that's perhaps the worry under all the worries that I think particularly families have, which is that you're kind of losing someone. And actually you're not, you're just getting the most kind of authentic version of them. You know, I feel like I'm the most me there is. And I think possibly quite begrudgingly now. I think my mum would probably say she was probably quite glad it all happened because, like, my life is so much calmer now. Yes, there was a turbulent period, but gosh, things are so quiet now.
Yeah, I would just say the same, that my parents they would say now that we have a better relationship than we've ever had, and I think they felt that I was hiding something from them consciously for much of my like teen and early 20s. They felt like I was keeping something from them. I was, but I didn't know that I was. You know, it wasn't that I
Yeah.
was consciously deceiving them. They just felt a barrier, and I think that barrier was a barrier I had to myself. And once that was lifted and I was able to really accept this thing about myself, I could be much more loving and present and connected and happy in my family. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, that really, one of it, like you said, I mean, I think there's this fear that people will change or they will become a stranger to you. And so often people, I do understand the language of mourning, but I always really bristle around the language of like, my child has died and now I'm like, yeah, I'm like, no,
Like,
no.
wow, I hope you don't actually lose a child because that is going to come
Yeah.
as a real surprise because that
Yeah.
child's not coming for dinner, whereas the trans one is
Right.
definitely coming for dinner. So
Exactly. It's like you're getting something else. You're getting something so much better, and your kid is you know, I always try to remind parents, even parents who are really freaked out, like the fact that your child, and I'm saying child, your child could be 60 years old when they come out to you, but your child is choosing to come out to you means they love you so much and they believe in you so much that they're sharing this news with you, and it's such a gift that they have decided to do this. And you know, I think you're very pragmatic in the book of saying, yeah, it doesn't always go well, but on the long tail, often people do come around, even people who have very bad reactions.
yeah,
And I know that's not true for everybody. I do know many people who are estranged from their families, and it's so painful. It's a huge wound.
sometimes
And
that happens. Sometimes that happens anyway. I know
it's
one of
true.
my best friends lost her mum last year, and they hadn't spoken for 40 years, and she is a
Yeah.
cis straight woman.
Yeah.
So,
It happens for lots of reasons besides transness. Yeah. And I've known lots of people who thought, oh, I will never speak to my mother again after this. And it took some time. but they have found their way back to each other. And I really do. I just always want people to remember that this is that what we're giving people is the gift of our truth and our actual selves. And that's something that, you know, is such an honor. And the more families and friends can hear that from the trans loved one in their life, the better, you know. So for kids who are you know, in the process of coming out now, I hope they remember that it's an honor, that they're giving people something, that it's not just a burden or, you know, something scary, that there's something really great about it too. And I think the further you get from that moment, the more you can feel like it's an honor and it's a good thing. I know early on it's just kind of scary. Well,
And then
so
it just becomes life. It just becomes your life. You know, I think, you know, 10 years later, I can't say I think about being trans all that much. Really, it just becomes about you living your life, and that's really, I think, all families really want for their children anyway, isn't it? Which is just to live a long and happy life. So
yeah, and then you start worrying about grown-up stuff like paying taxes and, you know, other
right. Oh yeah, you should be exempt. You should have a trans exemption from taxes. Like, life is bad enough, like, without taxes.
It's very true. Well, I want to encourage folks to click this teal button at the bottom of the screen to buy What's the Tea, the guide to all things trans and or non-binary from Karis. You can buy a copy and donate it to your child's school library.
That would be so lovely.
You can recommend that the public library carry it. Always request it from your library. It's really important that librarians have the data that shows that people want these books. That is actually how they are able to make requisitions. So definitely request it at this time when so many books, including Juno's book, are being challenged. It is important for people on the left to do our own book bullying and ask for the books that we want. There's positive ways to do that. So be assertive in asking for the books that you believe should be on your kids' shelves in schools. Don't be shy. It is really important. So Juno, thank you so much for being with us all the way from England.
Thank you. Gosh, I thoroughly enjoyed that. And it made me forget about feeling sick for 1 whole hour. So thanks.
Well, good. I do hope you feel better. But this was just a real joy. So I hope that you stay safe and well, and maybe we'll get to host you in Georgia sometime in the future.
I would love that. I would love that so much. Fingers crossed.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Good night, everyone. Bye.